summer of 1219, a Catholic friar, a holy man, a religious person, someone who dedicated himself to the religious life, made his way to Egypt, the summer of 1219. His name was Francis of Assisi, and he's probably well known to you because he was the founder of the Franciscan order, and he inaugurated a new mode of Christian spirituality and practice. He came to Egypt, came to the encampment of the Crusaders, who were involved in the Fifth Crusade that had made an assault on the coast of Egypt and were besieging the city of Damietta, which is on the coast. So at this encampment, he indicated his interest, his desire, his profound desire to cross the military lines and to go preach to the Sultan of Egypt, whose name was Al-Malik Al-Kamil. Why did he want to go? This is a subject of great debate and discussion. We have a number of early sources that give us insight. They vary with one another over many details of what happened. But it wasn't apparently the first time he had attempted to reach a Muslim sovereign and to preach to him. He tried to do that earlier in his life in 1208, but his ship was turned back by fierce winds and storms, so he wasn't able to go. Several years later, after a very important battle in the Iberian Peninsula, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, was it 1214? I always forget these dates. After there was a defeat of the Almohad dynasty that had been ruling parts of much of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, the way was sort of opened for Catholic preachers to go further south into Iberia than they had before, and he attempted at that time to go reach the Sultan of Morocco and preach to him. He fell ill, he wasn't able to do it. This time, however, he managed to succeed. He crossed the lines amid all kinds of danger. It was a war zone, okay, literally a war zone. There were rumors that the Sultan, in attempting to guard his lines, guard his territory, had issued an order that any Christian from the Latin West who had been part of this invading force who was caught would be immediately executed, and whoever could capture one would be given a gold bezant, right? So it was this dangerous thing to go beyond the Crusader encampment that was besieging the city of Damietta. But nonetheless, he decided to do so. He was captured, but he wasn't executed. He wasn't really particularly mistreated. In fact, instead, he was brought to the court of the Sultan, Al-Malik Al-Kamil, who, it's important to tell us who these figures are. Francis traveled with his companion, Friar Illuminato, who was the source for many of these later accounts, possibly a source of information. Sultan Al-Malik Al-Kamil was the Ayyubid sovereign of Egypt and was the son of Al-Malik Al-Adil, who was the brother of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, or Saladin, as he's known conventionally in Western languages. So he was part of this Ayyubid dynasty that had earned a great deal of acclaim for consolidating under one authority Egypt and the Levant, and very importantly, having reconquered Jerusalem and repulsing the Third Crusade that had taken place in the previous later decades of the 12th century. So he was a descendant of these great kind of warriors who were often seen as symbols of Muslim military resistance against the Crusades, okay? And that's important for understanding what made this episode and makes him a bit of a special character. So what was taking place was this Fifth Crusade, right? That had been launched. They'd laid siege to Damietta. At this point, they were still besieging the city. They hadn't yet taken it. This crusade army was under this divided loyalty between the cardinal legate, Pelagius, and King John of Brienne, who was the sovereign of the Latin kingdom, that is the Crusader kingdom in the east. This crusade had been called by a previous pope, very famous man, Innocent III, who had announced this crusade and organized it at this very important church council in 1215. That's very often seen as a very important in the history of church reform in Catholic Europe. It's the foundations, you might say, for Catholic Christian practices. Everybody had to then, as a result of these injunctions of this church council, they had to go to confession annually, for example, an important sacrament in the Catholic Church. However, at the same time, it was a crusade war council. And the two were actually kind of intimately related in Innocent III's thinking. He thought, we haven't been successful up to this point. We've lost Jerusalem. After the First Crusade, which was successful, each of the successive crusades hadn't really achieved their aims. And one of the clear aims was the return or the recapture of Jerusalem from the Muslims who had recaptured it in 1189. How to explain why they had failed? His idea was, it's because we've been sinful. And so what we need to do is to purge, right, and reform and purify our faith so that we'll be spiritually prepared in order to be successful, and God will grant us his favor as he did for those early First Crusaders. So that's the kind of atmosphere or the mentality that we normally associate, of course, with the Crusader relationship between Christians and Muslims. Something a bit different was going to happen, however, in this interesting encounter. Francis comes before the Sultan, and as I mentioned, he's not executed, he's not mistreated, and it appears from all the sources that we have that he carried on some kind of a dialogue with the Sultan at his court for a number of days and was kept there and entertained and fed and clothed. And the Sultan had asked him, well, initially thinking, have you come with a peace treaty? Why have you been sent here? And I mentioned the initial question, why did he actually go? It's unclear exactly what was his specific motivation. Was it to convert the Sultan? Was it to be martyred? Many of the sources, the early medieval sources, claim that Francis was actually desirous of martyrdom. He wanted to martyr himself, and that this had happened to some other preachers in Muslim lands, and he desired this for himself in imitation of Jesus' model, according to Christian doctrine, with the crucifixion, that he also wanted to be a martyr, like the early saints who had been oppressed in the early church, and also like Jesus himself. And so it was an aspect of his spiritual faith. Other people argue and suggest that he was interested in a different path, a path of love and a path of peace. And so some modern scholars argue that, in fact, Francis was against the crusade somehow, and that he instead wanted to preach to the Sultan in order to preach peace and to preach, could there be a conversion, could there be unity among these peoples in one sort of faith. So this episode is a very interesting episode. The different stories, nobody knows exactly what happened, but there are a lot of different stories in the 13th and 14th century sources that recount this episode. Some of them suggest that the Sultan was really moved by what he heard, but, he adhered to his religion, but he decided to honor and respect Francis, wanted to offer him all kinds of gifts, and gave him safe passage to return, if he wanted to return to the Latin West. One account by Bonaventure suggests that Francis took a rather aggressive approach and said, look, you're in error, and I want to show you that your religion is wrong and mine is right, and if you don't believe me, I'm willing to gather together all of your religious officials and your clerics, and we will have a trial by ordeal about which religion is the truth. Build a fire, and whoever can go in the fire and come through it unscathed, that person's religion will be the truth. All right? So that was Bonaventure's portrayal of what happened there. And according to Bonaventure, when this kind of challenge was made, one of the Sultan's kind of, holy figures or scholars who was in the court quickly sort of slipped away. And of course, who could blame him? So others suggest that the Sultan wanted to convert, but he was afraid of his population, right? So there's all these Christian views of this episode to try and figure out what was Francis attempting to achieve and why did he fail. Okay, it didn't work out. The Sultan doesn't convert and he sends him back. All the sources that we have are from the Latin West. So they're the ones who are trying to figure out how to make sense of this famous episode of a person who becomes a saint later on and whose saintliness needs to be established by these stories that they tell about him. So they didn't want to say Francis went and he failed and nobody listened to him. So they had to portray it in this way. But there were a lot of opportunities for different interpretations of the meaning of his encounter, of what he tried to do. Did he desire martyrdom? Did he desire to try and convert the Sultan? Was this seen by contemporaries as an alternative path than crusade? Was it an implicit criticism of crusade as violent confrontation with others? Jacques de Vitry, who was Bishop of Acre during the Fifth Crusade, had a view of this. He remarked and noted that the Sultan didn't, punish Francis for coming and challenging him on his religion, and he suggested that the reason why is because Francis spoke words of peace and words of truth without attempting to vilify Islam or to engage in polemical attack upon the Prophet of Islam, the revered figure that Muslims regard as their messenger who brought their holy book, Muhammad. So he avoided doing that, and he said that allowed him to actually talk and to preach to the Sultan, who was willing to listen to his words because he didn't vilify Islam. And he gave a good example of how you might preach by example and thus be more successful. Even if it didn't work, it means that this was a way in which you could express Christianity in dialogue with Muslims. Right? A different account by an anonymous, it seems like a lay crusader, who continues the account of William of Tyre's chronicle, who was the most important chronicle of the 12th century in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. It's a continuation of it. Actually is very interesting because it suggests that the Sultan was really sort of the hero of this whole episode. And that's what I want to get to, is what I think is the real important question, not about whether did he want to missionize, did he want martyrdom. I think the really important question that isn't always thought about or talked about is, why did the Sultan have an audience with Francis in the first place? Why did he listen? Why did he treat him in this way? Was this something very exceptional? And it's using this episode that I want to then go into the wider history of Muslim-Christian relations, okay? That the context and the background tells us that he's not actually that atypical, okay? Now why? Why is that the case? But first let's pay attention a little bit to the Sultan. He deserves, his moment here in the story. All these Christian sources, even that might be hostile to the Sultan, nonetheless acknowledge that he spared his life, treated him with respect, listened attentively, allowed him free passage, right? So it's a kind of an ambiguous portrait of the Sultan. It's kind of mixed positive, right? He's this Muslim sovereign, he's an enemy on some level, but nonetheless he also adheres to a kind of code of conduct that's respectable. That's to be noted. As I said, the anonymous crusade source portrays the Sultan in its episode, its retelling of it, as the Sultan actually receiving these Franciscan friars who were a bit rude and aggressive in, accosting him and reproaching him on the one hand, and he still treats them with dignity and respect, and on the other, that supposedly some of his religious scholars and holy men in his court said, oh, you should execute these guys. They're preaching against Islam, and you shouldn't tolerate this. You should suppress it, and we should just execute these Franciscans. And so the Crusader source actually portrays the Sultan as a hero for not listening to his own religious scholars and instead sparing the life of Francis and treating him with respect and sending him on his way. And one of the reasons how they tried to explain that is that the Sultan had sworn to obey the law which most pleased God. And then the Sultan says, since I've sworn to do this, it's my duty to uphold whichever, and what they mean by law, they mean religion, okay? Whichever way or path whichever way most pleased God. And he said, basically, it would be unjust. These people have come in good faith, right? So whether or not, we should be tolerating this, whether or not they abuse Islam and attack us, they came in good faith for pious purposes, are our guests. It would be unjust for me to mistreat them. Okay, so what the Crusader source says is that he upheld the law of justice and of reason, which is the foundation and above all of the particularities of different religious traditions and communities. It turns out, though, that in fact, actually from Muslim and Coptic sources in Egypt, that from a text, The History of the Patriarchs of the Egyptian Church, of the Coptic Church, a medieval 14th century chronicle that survives, that actually Al-Malik al-Adil actually had a pretty positive relationship and reputation among the Coptic Christian community in Egypt. And it's important to remember here that by this time, by the early 13th century, most scholars think that Egypt did not become a majority Muslim country until sometime perhaps in the late 12th or 13th century. So what we're talking about is a large and important community of Christians that have a Muslim sovereign. And they have kind of a memory of him being a pretty decent monarch and having some positive relationships. So for example, there's a story in this History of the Patriarchs of the Egyptian Church. There's a story of this monk from the Abba Macarius monastery, a Coptic monastery, who converted at some point to Islam, okay? Knew the king and decided, okay, maybe I should convert to Islam, and appears to have lived maybe for a year or two as a Muslim, but then repented of this conversion and decided he wanted to go back to his monastery, okay? Now, although, and we'll talk a little bit more about the wider patterns, this was seen as something that was typically unacceptable, right? To convert away from Islam. That was not something that was especially acceptable. Non-Muslims were tolerated. We're going to talk a little bit more about the conditions of non-Muslims in Muslim lands, how they were tolerated and accommodated. But converting out of Islam was something that was seen as prohibited according to Islamic law. However, what did the Sultan do? He said, well, given your circumstances and the fact that you've been a monk your whole life, and you decided at one point to, be interested in Islam, but now if you want to go back, I will give you permission to return to your monastery, and I will send out an edict, a declaration to all the subjects, in my land, all the officials, that you are to be respected for your religious choice, that you want to remain a Christian. Okay? Another case, at that same monastery, they were digging a well. They were doing, kind of expansion. They needed a new well. They were digging under the ground. They came across this trove of treasures. This is a favorite medieval story. There's always these stories. If you read Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, there's always buried treasure everywhere. And everybody's very interested in finding it and what to do with it. And usually the Sultan tries to grab it and keep it for himself, right? If it's found, it belongs to him, right? So they didn't know what to do in this case. Okay, what's going to happen? There's all this wealth. There's gold coins. There's, gold vessels, silver vessels, etc. What's to be done with it? Is it going to all just be confiscated and kept by the Sultan? He did an inquest of them, and the people who examined this to catalog it for him discovered that there was quite a lot of Coptic writing on it. So he determined this belongs to the Christian community. So he restored it fully to the monastery, which was such a kind of happy day in the kind of Coptic community, and particularly the adherents of the monastery, that they held a procession, a public procession, with their crosses held up high, aloft through the streets of Cairo. Okay, they were given this, opportunity to express publicly their religion, enjoy, and have a procession through the streets of Cairo. Now, I should say that when we say that most of Egypt during this time was probably Christian or was just turning to become a majority Muslim country, most of the Christian community, or the vast majority of Christians, lived in the countryside. Okay, so Cairo, the capital of the Sultan, was definitely, or by this time, a majority Muslim city. Okay, so that's what makes this quite stunning. Other stories, there's one where he was hunting and he had a pain in his stomach and he saw a Christian hermit. He told him his trouble. He asked him, what's wrong? O sovereign. He said, I'm feeling this pain. He said, okay, well, here's some oil. If you put it and rub it, I will bless it and you'll be healed. And he did that and he was healed. So he rewarded the monk, with a gift. And as it turns out, there was the need for a new patriarch that had come up, for a patriarch that is the chief religious official of the Coptic community. And there was a lot of political machinations, and the community wanted to put forward this highly connected political figure who might have influence and to be able to look out for the community vis-a-vis the government and so on and so forth. And instead, the Sultan tried to appoint this monk. He said, this guy is a true religious, and that's the kind of person who you should appoint. So he made him patriarch, but eventually the monk, being a true ascetic, otherworldly type of figure, refused and said, I don't want to. I'd much rather go and be, a quiet monk praying and fasting. And he said, okay, I'll let you. And then he brought in the more political guy to look out after the community. So we see a kind of interesting relationship that he had with the community. The last couple of points I want to make about him before moving on is that when I first got interested in studying medieval history, one of the things that really captured my interest was, as an undergraduate taking a medieval history course, was reading one of the medieval lives of St. Francis. I just thought he was stunning. This guy who preached to the animals, was preaching peace, was a peacemaker, who had this kind of obsessive desire to live this simple life, went against the paradigms of monastic life and decided to develop this in response to what he read as the literal life of Jesus and the apostles. Decided he wanted to abandon all property and go about through the world preaching peace, wearing a simple robe and a simple cloak, and having nothing for the morrow, as he said, having nothing for the morrow. There's a famous sort of story in one of these sources where he got mad at one of his friar's companions because he was soaking beans. And he said, why are you soaking the beans? And he said, well, we need to soften them so we can cook them the next day. He said, no, take no thought for the morrow, because he'd read that in the gospel, and he literally said we should not soak beans because that's taking thought about what comes. God will provide if you are. And these kinds of episodes reminded me so much of Sufi mystics and of the tradition of the mystical dimension of Islam, and the simplicity of their life, the ascetic regime. So I became fascinated with Francis, and I ended up working quite a lot on a comparison between Franciscan spirituality and Sufi mysticism in my sort of early studies. So I was always very interested in this tradition of Sufism and its connections with other religious traditions as a mode for crossing religious boundaries and religious identities for the love of God, for a kind of common spiritual idea or purpose. And it appears that the Sultan himself was also quite a devotee of the Sufis. He had in his court Fakhr al-Farisi, who was a Persian Sufi and seems to have been his spiritual advisor. He also is known to have been a devotee of the most famous medieval Arabic Sufi mystical poet, Ibn al-Farid, who was an Egyptian, and he had him in his court and tried to patronize him. And so we see that this kind of idea of spirituality may have informed the Sultan's attitudes towards other religions and other sorts of peoples, and he might have recognized in this friar who appeared to him as a simple holy man in much the same way that he saw that a monk who healed him and that he saw Sufis. The last thing I want to say about him is also quite interesting in the context of Crusader history, okay, which is that during the course of the Fifth Crusade, and even before Francis comes to preach before him, Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil had made an offer of trading Jerusalem for the city of Damietta, which at this point hadn't even been taken by the Crusaders. He said, if you lift the siege and go home, okay, and stop invading my country, I will let you have Jerusalem. Okay? Now this is a pretty stunning offer when you reflect that he is Salah ad-Din's nephew, okay, who was the recapturer for Islam, the great hero of the Muslims for defeating the Crusaders in recapturing Jerusalem, right? So, but he was willing, right, to make this this offer. The Cardinal Pelagius, however, rejected the offer, thinking that Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, is on his way any minute, and we're just going to conquer the entire Egypt. If we can just hang on long enough, we will have reinforcements and we'll conquer the entire area. Because you have to actually ask, what were they doing in Egypt anyway? Okay? Why were they in Egypt if their goal was, to conquer and recapture Jerusalem? It's because they saw it as part of a strategic unity and they wanted to conquer the entire region, right? So they weren't willing to sort of give up on receiving Jerusalem and having access and sovereignty over Jerusalem and the holy places simply, for giving up territory that they hoped they would be able to conquer. As it turns out, over the course of the Fifth Crusade, they attempt to invade further down the Nile, through the Nile Delta, and across, and they're absolutely destroyed by Al-Malik al-Adil, who captures them, but then, renews the offer. I will release all of you if, you give me Damietta, which by that time they had taken, and he concludes a peace. However, later on, in the Sixth Crusade, that same Frederick II, who was supposed to have joined the Fifth Crusade, gets in trouble with the Pope and is in fact actually excommunicated for not having fulfilled his oath to go on the crusade, ends up launching a kind of incursion to the Latin kingdom, goes to Acre with, at least a small force, and begins negotiating with Al-Malik al-Kamil, again, who is still at this time the sovereign, and ends up negotiating a treaty that gives them Jerusalem from the period of 1229 to 1244. As part of the deal, the city would be under Latin Christian control, but that Muslims would have sovereignty and control over the Temple Mount area, Al-Aqsa, and the Dome of the Rock, right? So they decided to come up with some sort of a bargain where the Christians would still have the holy places attached to Jesus, and the Muslims could keep their holy places, right? So he was able and willing to kind of come to these sorts of terms. But the Latins weren't always willing to do that. So anyway, that's him, and we really have to be impressed in some ways by the fact that he was willing to depart for practical or pragmatic or peaceful purposes, from the sort of tradition of his father and his uncle on some level. It doesn't mean that he wasn't interested in defending his lands and defending Islam, but he could see that sometimes you might need to make compromises, you might need to share these holy places, and he found ways eventually to do so with Frederick II and concluding a bargain with him. Okay, I think I'm going to have to hurry up. Okay, so was he really that exceptional, however? I mean, we can say that he was an interesting and exceptional figure on some level, but I argue instead that there's a broader pattern and history of Muslim-Christian encounters and relations that we have to take into account here and to put this episode into context, okay? So this is not just a mere episode that departs from some inveterate period of hostility, of a clash of civilizations, that it's some kind of exceptional case and just an episodic moment. I would argue that, in fact, actually, there's a broader Mediterranean pattern, particularly in Islamic lands, that helps explain and understand this. First point is just very briefly to say that the Quranic view of Islam, when it talks about this deen, this religion, it doesn't really talk about it as a new religion. Okay, it doesn't say this is some new religion, you all have to listen to it. It says this is in continuity with what was taught by previous holy figures who have been sent by God, prophets and patriarchs, and recognize, of course, many of these figures that we see in the Hebrew Bible and of course, Jesus. So I would argue that it actually represents a continuity of Mediterranean monotheisms, and that there's a reality to talking about it as a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. Okay, we have to talk about these three together as religious traditions that emerge, in fact, actually in the same region and often in relation to one another. and I hope I'll be able to illustrate this a little bit, that the point is that religions develop and change. The religious traditions and understandings and interpretations and the scholarly traditions around that make up what we think of as religion change and develop. And in many cases, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish interaction and contact affected both the Muslims as well as the other parties. And I hope I'll give you a few cases to illustrate that. What I want to suggest is that this encounter, usually when we talk about encounters between Muslims and Christians, we have in our mind, given where we are, in our mind, Latin Christian, Western European encounter with Islam. Okay? There was an awful lot of Muslim-Christian encounter that took place from the very beginning of Muslim societies because there were so many Christians in the Near East. In Egypt, I just told you about the Coptic community, right? And likewise, all across the East, there were Christians of Iraq, the Assyrians and Nestorians in Greater Syria, what encompasses today Jordan, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon. There were Jacobite, Maronite, Syriac, and Amalekite Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox communities. In Anatolia, which by this time, much of Anatolia is under the rule of the Seljuks, who defeated the Byzantine armies at the end of the 11th century and had much of Anatolia, obviously the Greek Orthodox community, and then Egypt, the Copts, as we've talked about today. So already in the East, there was long-standing interactions and relations between Muslims and Christians, just Eastern Christians and not the kinds of Christians we usually associate ourselves with because we don't know that much about Eastern Christian communities. In terms of encounters and relations between Muslims and Latin Christians, what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's an awful lot of overlap in the history of the Mediterranean between these communities all across the Mediterranean. So Spain, since 711, initial forays and conquests in the Iberian Peninsula until 1609. And you say 1609, what about 1492? Didn't they get rid of all the Muslims? No, they forcibly converted Muslims in the early 16th century. But of course, people continued to practice Islam, and because they were seen to practice Islam, or at least not to be good enough Christians, having been forcibly converted to do so, they were ultimately expelled in 1609. But that's a very long history in an area that we consider part of Europe. Similarly, North Africa, what is today Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, from the early Muslim conquest in the 7th century up until, maybe around the 12th century, there were major Christian communities. Anybody who studies, late antiquity and the early, Christian church, the period of the church fathers, who established most of the doctrines of the church as we know and understand it, would be familiar with somebody like Augustine of Hippo, whose famous City of God, his famous spiritual autobiography, The Confessions. He was Bishop of Hippo, which is in today's Algeria. Okay, so there were major Christian communities there already, so all across this period. And there continued to be a Latin Christian presence because, as a consequence of trading interactions, Latin merchants were given a fundaco, the funduk, a hospice or a hotel, a facility. It was like a granary, warehouse, and facility, some rooms and apartments for them to store goods and to live while they were engaged in trade, so that they could come to Tunis or other coastal cities on the southern rim of the Mediterranean and stay for months at a time, right? And be respected, their rights protected, and even allowed to have their own religious clerics come with them for pastoral care to service these expat merchant communities all around the Mediterranean, all around the coast of Muslim-controlled cities. They accommodated and allowed Latin merchants to have a base, a quarter, a fundaco for them to remain. Sicily also, from the early 9th to the end of the 13th century, was under Muslim rule until basically the second half of the 11th century. But Muslims persisted and continued there under the Latin, Catholic Norman conquerors of the island until perhaps, we don't really know exactly, until the end of the 13th century. And so Sicily was a very mixed place of Greek Orthodox, Latin Christian, Jews, and of course Muslims. One of the last ones I'll mention is the city of Lucera, which is there was a rebellion against Frederick II, that same sovereign I mentioned before, against him, and he decided to relocate all of these Muslims who had rebelled in the western part of the island, and he decided to take them and found a new city called the city of Lucera on the Italian mainland that existed until 1300. So you had right in the middle of Italy a Muslim city, okay? And they were Saracens, as they were known in Latin parlance, in the Latin West, that were loyal, attached to Frederick II. The Balearic Islands, similarly, people go now for holidaying, Mallorca, Minorca. These used to be mixed zones. They were liquidated of Muslims at the end of the 13th century. Okay? And of course, the Balkans from the 14th century to the present. And now you could say, in a way, that Europe, at least some parts where there's been very substantial migration and immigration, are also new Muslim Christian societies where people are finding ways to live together. Now, of course, the point of all of this is that most of the periods where there were mixed communities, mixed populations, multi-religious societies, happen to have been under Muslim governance. Okay? Now, they do persist and continue under the Latins in several places. As I said, Sicily, in Spain, but the long period here that we have is of Muslim governors over, often, especially in the early first few centuries after the Muslim conquest, in the first few centuries of Islam, a majority Christian population in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, right? And conversion was a very slow process that took place over hundreds of years, and typically without forcible conversion. And it might come as a shock to some Muslims that most scholars believe that the early Muslim conquerors in the first 2, 3, 4 generations, in fact, actually weren't even that interested, and might even have had policies of discouraging conversion. Okay? I can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. So, but the point is that there was toleration of religious difference of the people of the book, according to Islamic law, that gave these non-Muslim religious communities autonomy as protected peoples under their own religious leadership and religious law. So if you were Jewish, if you were Christian, you followed family law, inheritance law according to your religion. You had religious autonomy in that. You had to pay a special tax, so there were liabilities, and there were restrictions on public religious display, although I just mentioned cases where occasionally there were exceptions, like the procession of the Coptic monks who were so excited by the fact that the Sultan let them keep, all of that buried treasure. But there was no segregation or exclusion socially or economically, which is extremely important, that it was an integrated economy. And that has very important consequences and can be contrasted in some cases with some parts of Europe during this time. Just a map, so you have some sense of what we're talking about here at the end of the 12th century, so right before 30 years before Francis goes to visit the Sultan. Given that kind of history, then there was so much contact and awareness of one another and social coexistence over long periods of time, there were necessarily intellectual, cultural, and religious interactions. What were the manner in which these were to be conducted? There developed a kind of tradition of polite discourse and debate in the majlis, that is the sort of salon. Under the Sultan's patronage at his court, he would convene who are the important scholars, and it could be in any field, not just religion, but it was also a place where the sovereigns often invited different representatives of religious communities that he governed over to come and have a discussion, an interfaith dialogue, if you will, at his court. So under his patronage. And there developed a tradition of adab, of proper etiquette and conduct for how you should behave in the majlis, in the interfaith religious space. Here's an example from an 11th century account from Muslim Spain, Humaydi's account of how you're supposed to conduct yourself. What's proper etiquette? And I wish I would have to say that the last two debates of the presidential candidates that I had seen had adhered to even half of this tradition, okay? So we have the younger, weaker opponent should be granted the first question, so you always favor the person who you presume is in the weaker position. Let them make their case first, that they have full time to do so. You shouldn't presume to answer for one's opponent. So don't speak for your opponent. Let your opponent speak for themselves. Never yell or raise your... You should also look straight at one's opponent, okay? It's rude to be talking to someone else. If this person has made an argument and you're addressing them, you should address yourself to them. Don't address yourself to the sovereign just trying to make nice with him and say, oh, look, these people are wrong. No. Address the person you are actually in dialogue and discussion with, okay? Begin the session with an exhortation to respectful exchange. So everyone has to be reminded of this at the very beginning, and only after clarification of the conception and ethical parameters of the debate, okay? You first have to figure out what are the precise questions we're actually debating, so we don't go off on all kinds of tangents that could get us into trouble. What are we actually trying to discuss here? Policy, okay, in the case of our wayward candidates, right? But here, you have to have a precise boundaries of what we're actually here to discuss, right? And also, this is very interesting. When you're up there, don't preach. You're not there to preach. You're there to discuss, to learn, to make your case. So you should also not cite your own scripture. What good does it do for you to tell a Christian, well, the Quran says this? Because they don't necessarily accept the Quran. If you have something important to say about religious truth, find a way to say it in terms that others can recognize, okay? Very interesting idea that we have to have a ground of argument for actual discussion and debate. We can't just quote one another's scriptures against one another because we may not accept them. So what I'd argue is that there's a culture of reason and debate that's very important to how Muslims and Christians and Jews who participated in this understood how they should engage in inter and cross-religious dialogue and discussion. Okay, so I'll just try and summarize here by coming close to a conclusion. Some of what I think are some of the key interesting examples that illustrate a pattern and the forms of cultural, intellectual, and religious interaction and interchange in what I like to call, and is becoming more and more popular to call, Islamicate culture. Not Islamic culture, Islamicate culture. Why? Why not Islamic? We often talk about the glories of Islamic philosophy, the glories of Islamic science. Well, what was exactly Islamic about it? Well, we could determine precise things that were relevant to Islam as a religion, but you know, most of this tradition was conducted without regard to, you know, one's religion. There were Christian philosophers who taught Muslim students. There were Jewish theologians who were engaged in dialogue, or Jewish scientists and physicians who, you know, wrote important treatises or in mathematics that in Arabic that Muslims and Christians read. So it's a multi-faith shared cultural tradition that's conducted under the patronage, right, and sponsorship of Muslim sovereigns, okay, and under Muslim-governed conditions. So this is particularly the case with philosophy and science. I can't go into these details too much because we've been going on too long already, but there was, importantly, the sponsorship of the translation of Greek philosophical and scientific texts. Particularly, there's a very famous and important translator, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who was a Christian scholar who conducted many of the early translations from Greek into Syriac and from Syriac, which is another Semitic language, into Arabic. Likewise, there is a famous translation movement in the 12th, usually identified as the 12th century, in the 12th century in Spain. It happened in other places too, but usually it's talked about as the School of Toledo, and the translations from Arabic into Latin. And too often, this is characterized as a recovery to the Latin West of Greek and, you know, science and philosophy and knowledge, and it being restored to them. And that thanks to the Arabs, they kept it in hibernation in, you know, Arabic, and then we were able to recover it by translating it, as if the Arab commentators and scholars who extended and developed this tradition for hundreds of years weren't in fact valued. They were. In fact, they were very concerned. Just as in the modern culture of science, you don't care who did the work, you want the latest, best science. They were interested in the latest, best science, and they regarded Muslim, Arab, Islamicate science as of such a high standard that they wanted to translate many of the Arab Muslim scholars, right? And that included, in terms of philosophy, that it wasn't important only to study Aristotle and have access to his logics, his philosophical treatises. You wanted also to have the authoritative commentary on it, so that you could understand it better. And they regarded Averroes, or Ibn Rushd's commentary on Aristotle's work, as basically the standard. So everywhere in medieval philosophy, when they say the philosopher and they don't give you a name, they mean Aristotle. And everywhere where they say the commentator has told us that this means this, they mean Ibn Rushd. Okay? So that's how important it was. There are some problems, okay, that intellectually are trans-religious. That we see in the Mediterranean, within these traditions. I can't go into the details, but obviously theology, the nature of God. Okay? So there developed a very sophisticated kalam, or discourse, on these questions of the nature of God, and particularly this one issue of what's the relationship between God and his attributes, or his descriptors, the way in which he's described. The Quran, God in Quranic language gives himself many names, many attributes, right? The merciful, the compassionate, the just, etc. There's 99 in Muslim tradition, and one major issue was what's the relationship between the idea of a transcendent God and these other attributes that in some cases could be seen to be analogies of characteristics that human beings also have. Like it's possible for a person to be just, it's possible for them to show mercy, especially when there were attributes where it describes God as the hearing or the seeing. Well, how are we to understand these? Were we to understand these as hearing and seeing with ears and eyes the way we have, or did we have to have a different concept and understanding? These are the kinds of questions and issues that Muslim theologians wrestled with, how to understand that relationship. Well, likewise, Christian theology developed in relation to this important cultural and intellectual movement in 9th century Baghdad, 9th and 10th centuries, and it had an effect on the nature of Eastern Christian ideas of theology and the nature of the Trinity and how to talk about the Trinity, which is, of course, one of the key theological questions that has often divorced different sects within Christianity from one another, is different ideas of how to understand the persons of the Trinity and, of course, the nature of Jesus, right? So those are kinds of questions. In response, you might say, to Muslim kalam on the attributes, Christian kalam develops an idea that there may be all these different attributes. Okay? 99 in one tradition, the Jewish tradition. How many are in the Jewish tradition? Yeah. Of course it does, yes. But, okay, 13. Okay, so in any case, it's multiple, right? So you have these multiple attributes. How to resolve this? So what they came up with is analysis of the attributes, all of these attributes, and they would say and argue, well, they essentially boil down to only 3 from which the others can be derived. Okay, so that would be their argument for the nature of the Trinity, is that you could, seeing and hearing, okay, you can call them different attributes, but they're fundamentally similar things. They're about perception, right? So they're kind of intellectual, power. So they try to find a way to preserve the idea of a Trinity by finding triads of irreducible attributes of God, like the good, the wise, the powerful. Okay, that'd be one. They said, well, those are the 3 fundamental ones, and they would associate each of these with one of the persons of the Trinity and say, see, that's how you get the Trinity. Or eternal, rational living, right? So they come up with a whole bunch of these different ways of trying to do this. There are 19 different triads that we know from sources written by Christian theologians in Arabic and Islamic lands between the period of 750 to 1050. And this tradition makes its way to the west through the Mozarab, that is the Arabic-speaking Christian Catholics of Spain who adopt Arabic as their language but maintain their Christian identity in Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus. And they start adopting these same kinds of things, and ultimately there's suggestions by scholars that some of these ideas seem to influence Peter Abelard, and so you have this kind of trans-Mediterranean shared theological culture, okay? I shouldn't go on all of these. I'll just say that, the problem of reason and revelation, just fundamental to all of these monotheistic, universalist religious traditions that inherited the tradition of Greek reason, but also had revealed religious scriptures and had to find what's the relationship between these ways of gaining access to the truth, right? Do you need reason? Can reason stand alone? Do you need revelation? Does revelation have to be understood and interpreted through reason? These were the kinds of questions, and you find, in fact, actually, a great deal of symmetry in the solutions that the most famous and important Muslim theologian of the medieval era, Al-Ghazali, comes up with, the most famous Jewish scholar in the medieval period, Maimonides, and Aquinas and the Dominican school. They basically come up with a very similar kind of set of precepts fundamentally in how they're going to see the relationship between reason and revelation, that is a kind of confessional problem or question. And there's even the suggestion that Aquinas he mentions Maimonides, so we know he knew something about Maimonides. How did he know it? There's a lot of debate and discussion about that. He doesn't mention Al-Ghazali by name, but it's very clear that he's informed and influenced by a lot of his conclusions and his approach. And I would suggest and argue that the figure who's significant in my own work, this is the kind of thing I study, Ramon Martí, is the intermediary. He was a colleague of Aquinas, also a student of Aquinas' teacher, Albertus Magnus, in the University at Paris, studied theology there. He was, you could say, the first true Orientalist, Oriental scholar. He learned Hebrew, he learned Arabic, and he studied actual religious texts from the other tradition. And over the course of his works, he quotes Al-Ghazali innumerably from 13 of his works. Okay, so he was a really immersed, scholar of Al-Ghazali. He loved Al-Ghazali. I mean, he absolutely thinks he's so right on. It's just a shame he's a Muslim. Okay, but, everything else he has to say is great. That's his attitude and approach to Al-Ghazali. And you could say that even his important book, De Erroribus Philosophorum, is very much like the Tahafut al-Falasifa. Each of these are refutations of Aristotelian philosophy in the Avicennan, in the Averroesian tradition, the too much extreme reason. They have the same, very much basically the same title and approach, and he borrows Al-Ghazali's classification of the various errors of the philosophers, the 4 errors of the philosophers, as his template for his discussion of the very same issue. So it's obvious that there's a lot of interaction and knowledge. The last thing I'll say here is about the spiritual and mystical exchanges. I've already mentioned Sufism. I don't want to go any further into that. I'll just end with my last story, which is about the mystic and the monarch. We heard about the saint and the sultan. What about the mystic and the monarch? Well, it's a crusade story again, I'm sorry to say, but Saint Louis, he became sainted, embarked on the 7th Crusade. He was well known for his Franciscan-oriented piety. Sometimes he was jokingly referred to as Frater Ludovicus, Friar Louis, because he so much wanted to be like a friar, like a Franciscan friar. They end up reprising the exact same strategy of the 5th Crusade. They attack the coast of Egypt. They attack Damietta again. This time they take it very early on. It's not even defended. But he makes exactly the same error that the army in the 5th Crusade does in attempting to invade further south. They get cut off in almost exactly the same place and it ends up being an absolute disaster. He's captured and eventually ransomed. He spends time in Acre after this disastrous crusade, hoping to do some good by building up the fortifications in Acre and so on and so forth, but he enters into negotiations with the Sultan of Damascus at this time. This is in the 1250, about 1250, 1249, 1250, he sends a Dominican friar. I mentioned these Dominicans, Ramon Martí, who learned Arabic. The Dominicans start to learn Arabic and Persian. They call it Sarrasinois, so we don't. That is the language of the Saracens. So we don't know if it's Persian or Arabic, but he seems maybe to have known both. Sends Yves Le Breton as an envoy to conduct negotiations with the Sultan of Damascus, and according to this very famous account of the life of Saint Louis by Joinville, who was a junior member of the army and a young nobleman in the crusading army who ended up writing this account of Louis's life. That's very much an autobiography of his travels with Louis on crusade. Tells the story of when Yves Le Breton came back from Damascus. He was a very curious guy. He says, well, what did you see over there? What happened? Tell me something. And Yves Le Breton said there was this funny thing that happened. I was in the street, I was in Damascus, and in the street there was this old woman who was rushing around with a bucket full of coals in one hand and a pail of water in the other. And I said, where are you going with these two things? And he said, oh, with this pail of water, I'm going to quench the fires of hell. And I said, wow, that's a great idea, great idea. But what about the bucket of coals? And he said, with that, I'm going to burn down heaven. And he says, why? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? And she said, so that people would do good for love of God alone, and not out of desire for heaven or fear of hell. And he says, this was a stunning, kind of moment. This woman told me this, and it ends up becoming a big part of the legend of Saint Louis as a sort of exemplar of his particular spirituality, the love of God, right? And the willingness to sacrifice reward or punishment for just the love of God, whatever it is. It turns out, of course, some of you may have heard this story, that is verbatim. If you translate the Old French, it's verbatim, basically, of a very famous story told about Rabi al-Adawiyya, female mystic from Basra, who died in 801. So I doubt she was on the streets of Damascus. I don't know how to explain what he saw, but this is exactly the story of Rabi al-Adawiyya, who is known for her doctrine, particularly of love of God over all else. And so there are a lot of other stories in earlier sources that talk about how you should do good for God alone. They're very sort of some similar kind of things about this anti-eschatological piety. We're not concerned about the afterlife. We're concerned about loving God now and forever. That was her mystical approach. But you don't find this story in any of the earliest sources in the 10th, 11th century, even the Tabaqat Sufiya. There's a special book As-Sulami wrote about famous female Sufis. He has a whole chapter on Rabi al-Adawiyya. This story is not found in there. This story is only found later in a Persian text from 1350, Aflaki's Manaqib al-Arifin, his account of the Mevlevi Sufi order associated with Rumi. Okay? So that's some, 75, 100 years after the episode is supposed to have taken place. It appears in Persian in a Muslim text in the story that we have in Joinville. It's known that she was that was her doctrine, her mystic, but it really suggests, where does the story come from? Whose story is it? Is it the story of Saint Louis and what's his spirituality and the experience of Yves Le Breton, that he reports that's important in the life of Saint Louis as he becomes a saint in the Catholic tradition? Or is it a Muslim story about Rabi al-Adawiyya, even though it's not about Rabi al-Adawiyya until later it's attributed to her? So at least we can conclude that even in the context, I told you 2 crusade stories about Muslim-Christian relations. That's the reality. It happened. You have to acknowledge that. It doesn't help anybody to ignore that these things happen. But even in those circumstances, like St. Francis and the Sultan, like Yves Le Breton and this old woman, there can be moments of spiritual understanding and exchange across these religious traditions, even in the hostile atmosphere of conflict. Thank you very much for your patience. Sorry I went on quite long.